Thanks, Jessica. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me here. It's my first time in Berlin and Germany in general. Had a great time meeting a lot of you and just learning so much from some of the attendings here. I'm Guil Hernandez, coming to you from South Florida, and I work at Treehouse. I'm a front-end web development teacher. And Treehouse, we have programming courses and front-end web development courses. We're an online technology school. I specifically teach courses about CSS, JavaScript, and most recently React. You can find me on the Twitters as @GuilH at most places on the internet. And I love CSS, right? That's why I'm here. That's one of my favorite subjects to teach and talk about. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the more fascinating and interesting things happening in CSS right now. Because CSS now provides some really amazing tools, right, that empower us more than ever before and gives us more flexibility over things like design, images, effects, design, layout, color, even managing and reusing values, right? So if you haven't started using or looked into any of these features yet, I'm going to cover just enough to get you using them and help you begin leveraging these features to empower your workflows and improve your projects. And we're going to be looking at a little bit of code and lots of demos in the next 30 minutes or so. But I am going to post the slides after the talk. And for timing reasons, I'm not going to go into too much about browser support. But at the end, there'll be a resources slide with some links to that. So let's kick things off by talking about CSS variables, AKA custom properties. So we know that CSS can be immensely repetitive, right? And maintaining it can be cumbersome. Now, if you're using a preprocessor like Sass, you already used to declaring variables and keeping track of values in your style sheets. Well, as we all kind of know, since not too long ago, you can have variables directly in CSS. And like variables in preprocessors, CSS variables, they hold references to values that then you can reference throughout your style sheets. But there's plenty of differences to using CSS variables over preprocessor variables. And they're formally known as custom properties because you declare them using a new custom property syntax. That means you can name them anything you want as long as you prefix them with those 2 dashes, you assign a value, then refer to that property name in your CSS to use the value. Now, for example, if you're repeating the same color value in different places, you can create a variable that, say, your font size or base color. You set it to the repeated value like you would a regular CSS property. And what's cool is that they follow the rules of the cascade. So you first have to declare them on some element, and you'll often declare variables that will be referenced by many elements like your base color or base font size on the root, right? So you have to scope them to an element, usually the root. And what that does, it scopes them at the highest level of the cascade. That way, the values are available everywhere, and they can be referenced and inherited by all elements. Now, the browser doesn't do anything, right, with a custom property or variable at first. So to call the value, you have to use the var function to reference the value, rather. Now, with var in place, anytime you change the value of the custom property, it gets propagated, it gets passed down along to wherever it's being used. And it makes your CSS workflow a little less error-prone and a bit easier, right? Now, a property value can contain more than one var function. Like you see here, it's used 2 vars to define a gradient. It's also possible to assign a value to a custom property using other variables, like in this gradient custom property here. And you can use them for font stacks, layout styles, and so on to avoid code duplication. Now, this isn't terribly exciting just yet, right? Because we've been able to do this for some time with Sass or Bless and other in post-CSS, right? Well, custom properties weren't created just to be the CSS equivalent of preprocessor variables or even offer the same functionality, right? They can also do lots and lots of things that preprocessors can't. So let's look at why. So preprocessors and CSS variables, they're like 2 different entities. It's like they live in 2 completely different worlds. First, preprocessors, they don't run in the browser. And they live in a source file on your machine, right? And the preprocessors replace variables with static values when they're compiled to CSS. And the browser knows nothing about those variables, and the variables themselves know nothing about your DOM structure. Now, on the other hand, CSS variables are entirely more flexible than preprocessor variables. So when you update the value of a CSS variable, the browser updates it anywhere it's referenced, and it does it at runtime. So this makes them incredibly dynamic, and it opens up lots of other interesting possibilities than just replacing colors and font values. So let's look at some of those. For example, in Sass, you can't update the value of a variable from within a media query, right? But you can with CSS variables. You can update them live inside media queries. So for example, we have this gutter variable here, and it's initially scoped to the root element, and then it's referenced within the rule sets that need a gutter with var. And then you can use media queries to provide these new contexts that redefine the value of the gutter at certain breakpoints. So as you can see, that gutter property, the values are updated live at each breakpoint, right? The values themselves are sort of responsive to that. Now, CSS custom properties or variables, they behave like regular properties. So that means they can inherit, cascade, and they can be scoped to any selector. So here we have this base button class, right? And it uses a variable to set the background color of the buttons. And then instead of defining that button BG variable at the root scope, like we did earlier, we can declare it on different selectors, like button modifier classes here, right? Button callout, button info. And then we assign the values there. And those selectors, they provide a new scope. And what's great is that the properties, they get resolved according to the normal and inheritance cascading rules. Right? So the browser updates the values of that button just based on the class or the DOM element the variable is scoped to. And you can even update CSS variables inline within the style attribute. That's sort of how live they are in the browser, right? So scoping CSS variables to DOM elements gives us even more interesting possibilities. Since they follow the cascade and inheritance, we can style them based on where they appear in the DOM. So in other words, we can efficiently set how an element looks, right, when it's inside of another element with variables. So for example, to update the styles of a button component, just based on whether it appears inside a banner, a card, or a modal class, you might create descendant selectors like this to do that, right? Well, with CSS variables, we can update the styles without having to write these kind of complex selectors or descendant selectors that is going to couple your CSS to the DOM structure. So what this does is it makes the components you build completely extensible, right? So now the button can display a different font size, a color, background, or any property just based on where it appears on the page, and the CSS variable is declared on its parent. So here, this button rule lists the CSS properties whose values we want to update dynamically with variables. And then to change how that button appears, inside a banner, a card, or a modal, you define the different variables inside those selectors. So now any button class that's a descendant of banner, card, or modal can inherit these properties. And the best part is that they don't have to know anything about their context, right? We get this perfectly themable and reusable button component. You can also do simple calculations with CSS variables. So here, a handy use case is using the calc function to perform calculations that determine your length value. So this is using variables to build pixel and em values for margins. Now the variables can not only be updated using inheritance, as you saw earlier in David's talk, you can also interact with them, right, using JavaScript. You can get and set CSS values from your JavaScript, and that's where things start to get really interesting, right? So in this simple demo, we had the ball that's moving around the page, and it's just based on where you click on the page, right? Now, the background color and the CSS transform properties are all being updated live with JavaScript. And the way you interact with the CSS variables with JavaScript is with the get property value and set property methods. So back to the ball animation, this uses variables, right, to set the values for the background color and the XY translation values being created with calc. And then in your JavaScript, it's able to set the background color and those translation values with a set property method. So here we're just setting the values, not getting them. So for example, within a click event listener, it's setting the translation values to those XY coordinates at which the clicking happens with position X, position Y properties. And then to change the background color value, it's setting that ball BG property to a random hex value with a helper function there. So now that you've seen how and where CSS variables work, you should know where they do not work. So you cannot use CSS variables in selectors. You can't use them in property names either. You can only use them in values. They're also not valid in media query expressions, which is kind of a bummer. I wish they were. And you can't use them to create length values, like the middle box rule here. That's invalid. And again, you should use calc to build your length values using CSS variables. Cool. So let's switch gears here a bit. The evolution of CSS keeps providing more and more ways to help us make creative decisions in the browser, right? Because many of today's features resemble a lot of tools you'd normally use in your graphics editor. So blend modes, for example, you might have worked with some of these. Now, blend modes are part of the compositing and blending CSS spec. Compositing meaning combining two or more elements into one, like compositing an image with its backdrop. And blending is a form of compositing that calculates the mixing of colors wherever an element and its background overlap. So it defines how those colors mix in the overlapping areas. And CSS gives us two properties to create and blend elements together. So we have background blend mode, mixed blend mode, and let's take a look at some of these. So the background blend mode properly blends an element with a background layer. And the background can be an image, a gradient, it can be a color. And so for example, in this header rule here, we are blending a background image with a linear gradient, and then we're giving it a background blend mode of multiply, which is a common value for that. Now, what multiply does, it modifies the background area by multiplying the colors in the image by the colors of the linear gradient. And this particular combination makes for a more vibrant and beautiful background image, right? And you'll find that the background blend mode options are very similar to ones you'd find in Photoshop, right? You have screen, overlay, darken, saturation, and a bunch more. Now, mixed blend mode is a little different in that it blends the content of an SVG or HTML element with any content that's painted underneath it. So we're not just limited to background areas. So that means you can blend or composite two or more embedded images together. So for example, here, this image is inside a header. It has a dark background area. And with CSS, we can seamlessly blend them together by setting the image's mixed blend mode to lighten because of that dark area. Now, when I found out that you could blend an image element with a background layer, I started using mixed blend mode to help give my grayscale images some life, right? And color and create custom sets of colors for images. So for example, this rounded image. And I did have to place it inside a div or inside a containing element to do this. But you can give that div or containing element a background color, a gradient, and then, for instance, use multiply to just blend it together with the background of its parent. And what's cool is that grayscale images tend to have smaller file sizes than color images. So you can take advantage of that and use grayscale images in mixed blend mode to apply pretty much any series of colors to your images. And you could also do this with SVG, right? You can use the image element to render a raster image, and you give the SVG a background, and then you use your mixed blend mode. And in this way, you avoid writing some of that extra CSS that's required to make that image fit inside the div. And here's another example of mixed blend mode being used to create that knockout text effect. And for this one, it's kind of slow, but I animated the background, right? So you can really see that the true blending and compositing power of mixed blend mode. Now, another one of my favorite new CSS image effects that isn't part of blending and compositing, but it is part of the filters level 2 spec is backdrop filter. So if you've worked with CSS filters, you know that you can apply a series of these filter Photoshop-like effects to HTML elements. Well, you can have blur, drop shadow, grayscale, contrast, and invert, and a bunch of others. Well, the backdrop filter property lets you add some of those same effects, but to the area behind an element, right? So the way this works, it needs at least two elements to work properly, the backdrop filter feature. So you need a target element that you apply the filter to, like our filter rule here. And then you need an element behind or underneath the target, and that's the backdrop area. That's the area that's going to be affected by, and you apply the filter effects to. So for instance, this is setting the backdrop filter to invert the colors by 100% and blend them by 2 pixels. So any area behind that. And let's see, I made this draggable. So yep, so that's the filter element here. So if you take a look at this later, you'll see when you drag it around, you can see the colors invert in the background. Oh, here we go. I was doing it here. There it is. There we go. So yeah, so the colors are inverting, and then the backdrop area is being blended. Now, the backdrop filters can also enhance the modals and overlays in your design. So for instance, this overlay box there's a filter behind it that blurs the background area and darkens the hue to draw more attention to that overlay box and the content. And they're animatable too. That's one of the best parts. So you have a gallery or a product page where you need to click to expand something, right? Well, backdrop filter can enhance that and make it more interesting. So here it's blurring the background and adjusting the hue when the image scales up. So being able to apply these kind of blending and filtering effects to HTML elements just with CSS really gives us a lot of power and flexibility when we're designing and building our projects. Now, in a similar vein, one feature that is sort of letting us break out of that commonplace rectangular nature of displaying content on the web is CSS Shapes, because our designs usually consist of shapes like polygons and circles, but our content is usually contained with these rectangular boxes. Well, Shapes provide a whole new way to set how our context wraps or flows on the page. So we're able to use geometric shapes as CSS values and have our text flow around those shapes. So for now, the Shapes feature only works on floated element using the new shape outside property. So for instance, we can take this circular image here, float it left in our design, and then define an shape outside property to turn on the Shapes feature. That's what makes it work. And then the value you see here, the circle function, that's the new function that's going to create the CSS shape. For example, it's going to set the inline text to flow around the circular shape of the image. So that's pretty neat, but what's interesting is that you can also leverage the box model and use regular box model keyword values to flow content around a circular image, for example. So the image already uses a border radius to create that circular effect. So instead of having the browser do a little bit of extra work to redefine a circular shape, you can set shape outside to border box. We're all pretty familiar with that. And then the text will follow the outer image's circular border. Now, the way you apply a margin when you're using these box model keyword values is with the new shape margin property. So for example, here we're setting it to 20 pixels. And this is also a new property of the Shapes module. Now, the Polygon function, that's the one that's going to give you unlimited shape possibilities in your design, right? So with Polygon, you create a shape by defining those XY coordinates for each point in the polygon. So for example, you can set a text to flow around the right edge of a triangle using 3 polygon points. And that'll give you something like this. You see the content wrapping around the right slanted edge. This one's a little bit more complex. I define multiple polygon points to set the heading and paragraph to flow around the contours of my coworker Nick. And yeah, I use the handy CSS Shapes editor tool. It's a Chrome extension to create this and a lot of the shapes I experiment with Polygon. And if you haven't seen this yet, it's an interactive shapes editor that lets you edit polygon points, and you can immediately visualize how the text is going to flow around the shape you set. Now, a feature that works very well alongside shapes is the clip path. So clipping is a long-time feature of graphic design that's used to partially or fully hide parts of a graphic. So in CSS, the clip path property lets you clip portions of an HTML element. And like CSS Shapes, we're not limited to rectangular clipping paths. We're able to draw clipping regions with basic shapes, polygon points, even in SVGs. And so we use the clip path property, and that's going to create a clipping region that will set the visible portions of an element. So for example, you can quickly and easily remove background portions of an image in your design. For example, this dark area here. And we're giving clip path the circle property. It's a circle function, and that's one of the basic shape functions that's going to define a clipping path. So now any part outside of that clipping region, they become hidden or clipped, right, to reveal the circular image. So using, what's great is that using clip path and CSS Shapes, they work hand in hand. So you can reuse your clip path values, right, to define a shape around your clipping path. They both use exactly the same syntax. So for example, here we're providing the shape outside property, the same exact circle function we gave clip path, and that's going to flow text around that clip region. It looks really wide there. So in your markup, you can also do this with SVG, right? So you use the clip path SVG element inside it, and you define all your polygon points. And then in your CSS, you can reference that clip path with the clip path property, the URL function, and then you call up the clip path ID. And then that could produce something like this, right? So this is the heading with a div with a background image. And as you can see, the polygon points, they follow the exact shape of the mountaintop. So as a result, those portions get clipped and clip out the bottom part of the text. Now, to help you set clipping paths, developer Bennett Feely, he built this really fun and useful tool. It's an interactive tool called Clippy. And you can use the tool to create clip paths, shapes, or just simply experiment with what CSS clip path can do for you, right? So to give you an example, we've all seen that trendy slanted header effect on websites and applications. I've seen it done with pseudo elements and transforms. I've seen it done with SVGs or with an image. Well, with a tool like Clippy and clip path, you can really create it pretty quickly in a few seconds. You just drag the controls around to create the shapes, then copy and paste the code it spits out into your CSS, for example, the header rule. And you get that visual effect. And what's great is that when you use percentage-based coordinates, it's going to give you flexible and responsible clipping paths. All right, now color module level 4 is going to give you new and interesting ways to apply color values in your CSS. So you're going to have new color functions that let you adjust and modify colors. You're going to have new values for setting the opacity of colors. And one of those is 8-digit hex notation. And this is going to let you set RGBA channels as regular hexadecimal values. So in other words, you get to do alpha directly in hex by simply tacking on a pair of digits to the values. So those last 2 digits specify the alpha channel of the color, where value of 0, 0 gives you a fully transparent color, and FF represents a fully opaque color. And it uses the regular hexadecimal system to define the alpha. So if you're used to defining your values in RGBA or HSLA, you'll find that it can be a little bit unintuitive at first. So for instance, if you want to set a 50% transparency, you're going to use 80, not 50. And then 80 would be CC, 20 is 33, and so on. So it can be a little tricky at first, but there are some charts out there that you can use as a reference for 8-digit X values for alpha. And one of the best places to use these are going to be in places where you've already defined hex values and you just want to add opacity to it, right? Or if you just heart using hex values in general, those extra 2 digits might save you the time it might take to look up the RGBA equivalent of a color. Now, browser support for 8-digit hex is currently limited. It's limited to Firefox and Safari, but you can also use it in Chrome if you've enabled the experimental web platform features. Now, not all hex, RGB, HSL values are easy to remember, right? So if you're writing plain CSS, changing or adjusting a color value often means having to reference your graphics editor or color tool. And preprocessors already offer color functions, right, that can apply transparency to colors, that has functions that can darken them, lighten and blend them. Well, CSS is about to take a huge leap forward and get a color modification function of its own. The new color mod function is going to let you manipulate colors by taking a regular color value and applying color adjusters to it. And these color adjusters are like smaller functions within color mod that, for example, can adjust a color's hue, the alpha, lightness, saturation, blend colors together, and lots more. Now, the spec for this function is still a working draft, so it doesn't really have good browser support yet, but you can use it, you can start using it in PostCSS. It has a color function that works exactly the way the color mod function is supposed to work. And in fact, color mod was named color, and it was recently renamed color mod. And you can begin experimenting with it in CodePen if you've enabled PostCSS and the color function add-on. So let's take a look at how some of those work. So for example, we have a lightness adjuster here, and that lightens a color value by the specified amount. So for example, 20% here. You can also take away lightness by setting a negative percentage value. But the best part is that you can pass 2 or more adjusters to your color mod function. So alongside alpha and lightness, the hue adjuster you see here changes the hue of a color by rotating the color wheel by the specified amount. So for example, 5 degrees here. Now, if you throw CSS variables into the mix, you can start to see how useful the color mod function can be for creating color palettes in your design from a small set of colors or from a single base color. So here we have a set of color variables, and they're created from a base color, crimson. And it's using adjusters like hue and lightness and It's even getting the complementary colors just to create strong visual contrast. So now you can change that base color to any value, like cornflower blue, hot pink, and crimson. And the rest of the colors are just going to adjust to that base value. The result is a completely different color combination each time. So having a way to quickly explore and manipulate colors on the fly, right, while working in the browser, with a simple intuitive function like color mod is going to be a huge, huge win for CSS. And there's a really neat tool out there called colorme.io. And you can use these to compose your colors and experiment with all the color functions and all the adjusters. Cool, let's keep moving. So selectors level 4, there's lots and lots of new selectors on the way in level 4. Now, many of them are not supported by browsers yet because it's still sort of a working draft. Now, I'll spend a little bit of time covering some of the selectors that I've found useful just in my own work, and some that have the most browser support. And one of those is matches. So matches is a functional pseudoclass, and it's going to help you write complex selectors or descendant selectors a lot faster. And what it really does is just provide a little syntactic sugar for creating groups of descendant, direct child, even sibling selectors. So matches is, it takes a regular selectors as arguments. So for example, here the selector is going to match any button class that's a descendant of card, modal, and form. And it's the same as writing the full selector group you see there below it. You can also pass pseudoclasses, so this is going to make it a lot easier to, for example, style your links. This is targeting the hover, focus, and active, visit it all at once. And inside matches, you can't pass pseudo elements and combinators, but you can still create selectors using matches in a combinator outside that argument list. So for instance, this is going to match any paragraph that's an adjacent sibling of image, paragraph, and form. And as you can see, it saves you a little time, right, by helping you to avoid writing out all those selector combinations manually. Now, if you do a search for browser support on matches, you'll find that it's implemented under the name any, as it was originally known, but it looks like it's going to be standardized in level 4 under the name matches. There's also new optionality pseudoclasses that target form controls like text fields, text areas, and selects. And it targets them based on whether they are optional or required, so you can style them differently. And there's the ones I really enjoyed using and had fun in my own work are the validity pseudoclasses, and these let you give your users visual feedback just based on the validity of the data they type into a field. So for example, if you have an email input field that's required, you can define invalid and valid pseudoclasses that style them just based on what the user types into the field. So here it checks if you've entered a valid email format, for example. And then add pseudoclasses to the mix, pseudo elements to the mix, and it can be really useful to give users even more visual feedback. Like you can display an icon when the data goes from invalid to valid. So here it's going to display that smiley emoji, for example. Now you can take things a few steps further and display an icon for both invalid and invalid emails. Now normally you'll maybe use JavaScript, right, to do something like this, but with CSS you get these input validation checks for free. Now it's not going to check if the email itself is a valid email. It's just validating the inputs according to the validity semantics defined by HTML. And there's a few sites out there that can help you keep track on browser support for these level 4 selectors. If you don't want to individually search for them on, for example, caniuse.com, you can use css4selectors.com to see if your browser supports some of these, and it'll let you know. Now, finally, some of the features I've talked about, they're new to browsers, right? So they're not all supported yet everywhere, but that shouldn't mean that you can't use them, or at least begin experimenting with them, right? You're still able to use a lot of those today while providing these elegant fallbacks for browsers that don't support them using feature queries. So the @support rule is bringing native feature detection to CSS. So it can analyze whether or not a browser supports a CSS property. And it looks a lot like a media query. So for example, here at the bottom, this is querying for grid layout. And it's specifying the property value pair used to define a grid, display grid. So then inside the rule, inside the supports rule, we are including all the grid styles for the content. And then Flexbox currently has better support than grid, right? So the browsers that don't support grid layout are going to lay out the content using the Flexbox properties defined outside the feature query. So it's kind of like having Modernizer, which is a feature detection tool built with JavaScript, but right in the browser. It's going to perform a lot faster. And you can query multiple features at once. So for example, here up top, we have the AND operator, and that's checking for grid and writing mode support. And writing mode is also a new CSS property that changes the layout and alignment of text. So in browsers supporting both features, users will see something like this. And browsers that don't support these will simply display a normal heading and paragraph, which isn't a big deal. And as you can see, they have really good browser support. The feature queries do, and the supports rule. And then browsers that don't support these feature queries, they're going to ignore what's written inside the support rule and just fall back to your regular CSS. And finally, here's the list of the browser support links I talked about earlier that covers all the features I talked about today. And yeah, as with almost anything in front-end web development and web development, there's so many features and factors to consider when building your projects. So many of the things I've covered are really enhancement features, right? So you don't want to overdo it, and you want to be sure that your design and content still speaks to your users, even with some of these features in place. So hopefully, what I talked about today gives you lots of interesting new ideas for your next projects. And as I always tell students at Treehouse, right, use all the guidelines and suggestions and the things you learn and see just to find what works best for you and your project and your team. You don't have to immediately use all the new things and learn everything just because they're popular at the moment, right? It's a matter of preference, a lot of it. So what's important, you develop your own approach, style, and just be consistent about it, right? And that's all I have for you today. Thanks, everyone.